A federal judge has ordered the administration to begin refunding $130 billion worth of tariffs. Lydia, who's been following the story. OK, Lydia, how many companies have filed lawsuits to get their money back?
Stuart, thousands.
Thousands.
By counts, it's more than 2,000 companies that have filed their lawsuits, according to reports. We were talking about big business, Costco, FedEx, Pandora, and they're looking to benefit from the tariff challenges that were initiated. Remember, it was the small businesses who filed the lawsuits. Now the big businesses are lining up to get their money back as well. The judge's order is coming after the Supreme Court invalidated some of President Trump's tariff powers just last month. And this order directs U.S. Customs and Border Protection to begin recalculating duties that importers paid and determine how much money needs to be returned. Now, on top of returning the tariffs to be paid, the estimates range, as you said, from $130 billion upwards of $175 billion. The government also revealed in a new filing that it will also pay interest on the refunds. That's estimated by the Cato Institute to be $700 million per month.
All right, crew. Adam, speaking time to get loud. Let that number sink in for just a moment. $100 billion. That is the amount of money the U.S. government has already been forced to return to importers. Companies that paid tariffs that a federal judge has now declared were completely unlawful. And here's the really staggering part. That number might just be the beginning. Estimates suggest the total refunds could climb as high as $175 billion before this legal battle finally reaches its conclusion. And the Trump administration is fighting tooth and nail every single step of the way. Because this is not just about money. This is about a president who built a massive portion of his second-term economic agenda on these tariffs. And now he's watching a federal court systematically dismantle that agenda, one refund check at a time. $100 billion already out the door and counting. This is the story that is not getting nearly enough attention. And today, we are going to fix that.
It has been exactly 6 months ago now that the U.S. Supreme Court decided in a 6-3 vote that the president's import tariffs were unlawful. With that, the administration was forced to return the tariff money it gained back to the American businesses that took this financial hit. First for you here tonight at 6, senior reporter Eric Min is with me in studio after checking in with local businesses once again today. Eric, you have spoken to these entrepreneurs throughout this last year about this very topic. So, question, how are they doing right now, Eric?
Good evening, Brock. This afternoon, I had a chance to talk to 2 area business owners, and they both told me they have received tariff refunds. Well, one of them received all of the money back. The other only saw some of it.
I did receive a full refund of everything that I paid in, plus a little bit of interest.
A familiar face in national headlines. Beth Beneke is the owner of Orinoco-based company Busy Baby. She tells me her full tariff refund was about $50,000.
Let's set the stage, because to understand what's happening right now, you need to understand what happened earlier. The Supreme Court issued a ruling that stopped Trump's broad emergency tariffs in their tracks. The court said in a decisive decision that the president does not have unlimited authority to impose sweeping global tariffs just by declaring an emergency. That power belongs to Congress. The Constitution is pretty clear on this, and a majority of justices, including 2 that Trump himself appointed, agreed. So those tariffs, the ones Trump had imposed using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, were struck down, invalidated, gone. The legal basis for collecting them simply vanished. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Because striking down a tariff going forward is one thing, but these tariffs had already been collected for months. The government had already taken in more than $130 billion from importers under these tariffs. Companies had already paid. The money was already sitting in U.S. government accounts. So the question became, what happens to all of that money that was collected under a policy that the Supreme Court just said was illegal?
Starting today, businesses can ask for their money back after paying billions in tariffs. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled President Donald Trump did not have the authority to impose those fees. A new refund system is officially launching, and importers can make claims for refunds with interest. Those payouts could total $127 billion.
There's a lot. So let's bring on in our Scripps News Group's Joe St. George. Hey, good morning, Joe. Good to see you, sir. How much money could businesses actually get? Where is it coming from? And the big question, could consumers ultimately get any type of refund too?
The all-important question, right? Will you get a check from the business that you bought something from and that business paid a tariff on? It may require a court order, but there's certainly a chance that that's where this story goes. It just doesn't look like it's going to be a very fast process.
Do the companies get it back? Does the government keep it? Who decides and how? And that's exactly where a federal judge stepped in. And his answer was simple and devastating for the administration. Pay it back with interest. And the Trump administration is not happy about that. Not even a little bit. Before we go deep on the legal mechanics, and we are going to go deep because this story is genuinely fascinating once you understand what's actually at stake, let me tell you why this matters beyond the politics. Because this affects real businesses, real supply chains, real American companies that have been operating with a massive extra cost hanging over everything they import. Think about manufacturers that rely on foreign parts. Think about retailers that import goods. Think about small businesses that buy materials from overseas. All of these companies have been absorbing the cost of these tariffs, either by eating the expense themselves or by passing it along to consumers in the form of higher prices. And now a federal court is saying that money was taken from you illegally. You are entitled to get it back.
At this point, a federal judge has just ruled that thousands of businesses should receive refunds for tariffs. This comes, as you might remember, after the Supreme Court's ruling that basically illegitimize the Trump administration's tariffs. This is a multi-billion-dollar setback for the White House because it's ordered the Trump administration to start refunding these tariff costs, and more than 2,000 companies have filed lawsuits seeking refunds. Many of them are big businesses like Costco and FedEx, and they're trying to benefit from some of the legal challenges issued by small businesses. This is also something to keep in mind because this order is directing U.S. Customs and Border Protection to begin recalculating duties importers paid and to figure out exactly how much money needs to be returned. On top of returning tariffs paid, estimates range from $130 billion upwards of $175 billion. The government revealed in a new court filing it's also going to pay interest on the refunds, estimated to be nearly $700 million per month, which is really just incredible. So
that's not a small thing. That's potentially billions of dollars flowing back into the American economy, back to the businesses that paid it, with interest on top of that. And the Trump administration is appealing, fighting to keep that money, fighting against the refunds. And that fight is still very much active right now. So this is the situation. The Supreme Court struck down the tariffs. A trade court ordered the refunds. The administration has already paid out roughly $100 billion. And now the fight is over. How much more has to go back and to whom? That's what we're breaking down today. By the time we're done, you're going to understand this story better than 90% of the people covering it. Let's actually get into the mechanics of what's happening here, because this is one of those stories where the details really matter. And the details are genuinely wild once you start pulling on them. The Supreme Court ruling was decisive. The court said that Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose broad global tariffs was unlawful. Now, IEEPA is a real law. It gives the president emergency powers to regulate commerce with foreign nations during a national emergency. Trump had declared a national emergency, specifically citing trade deficits and what he called economic threats from foreign countries, and then used that declaration as a legal basis for slapping tariffs on basically everything coming into the United States from a huge list of countries. Broad, sweeping, massive tariffs. And the revenue from those tariffs, that $130 billion and counting, was real money flowing into the US Treasury. So the legal question before the Supreme Court was straightforward on paper, even if the answer had enormous consequences. Does IEEPA actually give the president the authority to do what Trump did? And the court said no. The emergency powers in that law have limits, and what Trump did exceeded those limits. Game over on that legal question at least. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part that most people completely miss when they read the headlines. Striking down a tariff going forward is simple. You just stop collecting it from this point forward. Done. No more IEEPA tariffs. Easy. But what about all the money that was already collected before the ruling came down? That's a completely different legal question. And it's the question that landed in front of a federal judge at the U.S. Court of International Trade. Now, the Court of International Trade is a specialized federal court. It deals specifically with trade disputes, tariffs, customs, import regulations. It's not a court most people have ever heard of, but right now it might be one of the most consequential courts in the country because the judge had to figure out, given that the Supreme Court said these tariffs were unlawful, do the companies that paid them get their money back? And if so, which companies and how much and through what process? This is wild because the answers to those questions determine whether we're talking about a $100 billion refund or $175 billion refund. We're talking about a $75 billion difference depending on how those questions get resolved. That's not a rounding error. That is an enormous amount of money. And here's the thing. The Trump administration is arguing, and this is actually an interesting legal argument, even if you think the overall tariff policy was wrong, they're saying that not every company is automatically entitled to a refund. Specifically, they're arguing that companies whose tariff payments had already become final, meaning companies that didn't file a protest or a challenge before the Supreme Court ruled, might not be eligible for refunds. The logic is something like this. In normal customs law, there are procedures. If you think you were wrongly charged a tariff, you file a protest, you dispute it, and if you win the dispute, you get your money back. But if you paid and didn't protest, if you just accepted the charge and moved on, then at some point, that payment becomes legally final. And the administration is arguing that the refund order shouldn't override those finality rules for companies that never protested. Can you believe this? The government collected money under a law the Supreme Court just said was unconstitutional. And the argument is that some companies who just paid it and went back to work because they were running businesses and didn't have time to file individual customs protests, those companies might not get their money back. That's the position. And yet, the judge didn't buy it for the companies that came before him. He ordered the refunds. He said importers subjected to the invalidated tariffs were entitled to the benefit of the Supreme Court decision. And he directed Customs and Border Protection to process shipments and calculate duties without those unlawful tariffs with interest where applicable. The administration appealed, and that fight is ongoing. Let's talk about what $100 billion in refunds actually represents, because I think people hear that number and it doesn't fully land. $100 billion. That's more than the annual GDP of many countries. That's more than the entire budget of most federal agencies. And it's flowing, or supposed to flow, from the US Treasury back to the companies that paid it. Now, the administration has said that as of early August, approximately $100 billion in refunds, including interest, have been completed and sent to the Treasury for disbursement. So some of the money is moving, but the full picture, the potential $175 billion total, that gap is still being fought over. And every day that the appeals drag on is another day that some of that money stays in government accounts instead of going back to the businesses that paid it. And here's the broader political dimension of all of this. Because Trump built a major part of his second-term economic identity around these tariffs. He talked about them constantly. He framed them as the solution to America's trade imbalances. He promised that they would bring in massive revenue and force other countries to make better deals with the US. And for a while, they did generate massive revenue. That $130 billion plus that got collected before the Supreme Court ruling. But now, the legal foundation for all of that has been ripped out and the revenue is going back. And the policy argument Trump was making, that he had the authority to do this, that it was good for the country, that the tariffs were justified, has been rejected by the highest court in the land. This is wild, because what you're watching in real time is a president whose signature economic policy just got invalidated, and not quietly, publicly, with a $100 billion refund order attached to the decision. That's about as loud a repudiation as the legal system can deliver. Now there's one more piece of this that I want to get into, and it's the question of interest. Because the judge didn't just order the government to return the principal, he ordered refunds with interest where applicable. And that matters because we're potentially talking about refunds that have been owed for months. In some cases, for over a year. If you paid a tariff in early 2025 and the refund is coming back in late 2026, you've had that money locked up for over 18 months. And interest on hundreds of billions of dollars over 18 months adds up fast. The interest component alone could represent tens of billions of additional dollars flowing back out of the Treasury. And the administration knows that. It's part of why they're fighting the broad refund order so hard. Every percentage point of interest on every $1 billion of principal is real money. And right now, the math is not moving in the administration's direction. Let's also talk about what this means for American consumers, because this whole story is usually framed as a fight between the government and big importers, corporations arguing over money. And yeah, sure, corporations are the ones filing the legal claims, but the people who actually absorb the cost of these tariffs were not just the importing companies. Those costs got passed down. When a business pays more to import something, it doesn't just eat that cost quietly and move on. It adjusts its prices. It passes the expense along to whoever is buying from it. And whoever is buying from it, in a lot of cases, is you. American consumers have been paying higher prices on a whole range of goods throughout this tariff period. Electronics, clothing, tools, auto parts, machinery, components. If it came from overseas and got hit by these tariffs, the price of it went up somewhere along the supply chain. And while the refunds going back to importers won't automatically translate into lower prices for consumers, because those businesses are not going to send you a check in the mail. What it does do is remove a massive ongoing distortion from the economy. The unlawful cost that got baked into pricing decisions is gone. The legal basis for it has been struck down, and the money collected under it is being returned. That matters, even if most consumers never see a direct refund. The removal of an unconstitutional tariff burden from the economy is a real thing, and it's worth understanding in full, because this is not just a boardroom story. It's an everywhere story, and most people don't realize it yet. Let's get clear and clean on this, because there's a lot of moving parts here, and I want to make sure you leave this video with a solid picture of what's actually happening and what comes next. First point, the Supreme Court ruling is not going away, and neither is its impact. The decision is settled law. The president does not have unlimited authority to impose sweeping global tariffs using emergency powers. That's done. You can't appeal it. You can't work around it. And every legal fight that's happening now, the appeals, the refund disputes, the arguments about which companies qualify, all of those fights are downstream from that one ruling. The Trump administration can argue about the details of the refund process all day long. But the core legal question, were these tariffs lawful, has already been answered. No, they weren't. And that answer shapes everything else. The refund fight is really about how big the final number is, and the administration is trying to keep it as small as possible. Right now, the administration has acknowledged sending roughly $100 billion in refunds to Treasury for disbursement. That's already a massive number. But the total potential exposure, if the broad refund order holds on appeal, could reach $175 billion. So the gap between what's been paid and what might still be owed is roughly $75 billion. And that $75 billion is what the appeals are really about. The administration's argument that companies whose payments became final without a protest filed might not qualify is an attempt to narrow the pool of eligible recipients and reduce that total number. The government collected money under an unconstitutional policy. And the argument is that some of the people who paid it just did so too quietly to get it back. That's the position, and it's going to keep getting tested in court until there is a final answer. This case is bigger than tariffs. It's about the limits of presidential emergency powers. And this is the part that matters for the long game. Because IEPA has been around since 1977, and presidents of both parties have used it over the years for various economic tools. What the Supreme Court did was put real limits on how far those emergency powers can go. The court said, you can't just declare a national emergency and then use that as a blank check to reshape the entire global trade system. That's Congress's job. The Constitution put that power in the legislative branch for a reason. And this ruling doesn't just apply to Trump. It applies to every president going forward. Which means the next time any president, Democrat or Republican, tries to use emergency powers to impose broad economic policies, they're going to run into this ruling. This is wild because a decision about Trump's tariffs ends up having implications for executive power that go way beyond tariffs and way beyond this administration. That's how Supreme Court rulings work. They set precedent, and this one set a big one. The $175 billion question is going to define the next chapter of this story. Because right now, we're at $100 billion in acknowledged refunds. And the fight is over whether that number stops there or keeps climbing. If the appeals courts uphold the broad refund order in full, if they say every importer who paid the unlawful tariffs is entitled to refund with interest, regardless of whether they formally protested, then that number goes higher, significantly higher. And that has real consequences for the federal budget, for the Treasury, and for the businesses waiting on their money. Think about what some of these companies have been dealing with. They paid money under a tariff that's now been ruled unconstitutional. They've been waiting for refunds, and the process is still grinding through appeals courts. Every day that drags on is another day of uncertainty for businesses that were already operating in one of the most volatile trade environments in modern American history. And let's be real about what this means for Trump politically, because this is not just a legal loss, it's a narrative loss. The whole framing of the tariff policy was that it was strong, that it was a negotiating tool, that it was generating revenue that was going to benefit America. And now the revenue is going back. The legal foundation has been stripped away. And a federal judge is overseeing the process of returning $175 billion that was collected under a policy the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional. That is a genuinely difficult political story to spin. You can call it a witch hunt. You can say the courts are wrong, but the money going back to the companies that paid it, that's not something you can argue away. That's a real, measurable, undeniable consequence. And it's playing out in real time in federal courts with public filings and documented refund amounts that anyone can read. And here's something nobody is talking about enough. The precedent this sets for how future administrations use emergency economic powers. Because what just happened here was not subtle. The Supreme Court looked at a president using emergency legislation to reshape the entire structure of American trade policy unilaterally without Congress and said, no, that is not what this law allows. And that ruling applies to everyone going forward. The next Democratic president who wants to use IEEPA to impose economic sanctions or tariffs in creative ways, they're going to hit this wall too. The next Republican president after Trump, same thing. Emergency economic powers have real limits now, documented, Supreme Court confirmed limits. And any president who tries to push past those limits is going to face a court challenge that, thanks to this ruling, already has a very clear answer waiting for it. That's genuinely significant, not just for trade policy, but for the broader question of how much unilateral economic authority any president actually has. And the answer the court gave, less than Trump claimed, is going to echo through administrations for years. This is wild when you zoom out. One tariff fight about trade deficits ends up reshaping the legal landscape of presidential emergency powers for a generation. That's the actual legacy of this case, and most people have no idea it's happening. One more thing worth flagging. The interest component of this refund order is something the administration really doesn't want to talk about publicly, because when you're refunding $100 billion or more, and you're adding interest on top of that, calculated from when the unlawful tariffs were originally collected, the interest alone adds up to a number that would make most people's eyes water. And that interest accrues every single day the appeals drag on. So there's an argument that the longer the administration fights this, the longer they delay the full refund, the bigger the total bill gets. Fight the refund long enough and you might end up owing more because of it. That's the corner this appeal strategy could paint them into, and it's something worth watching very closely as the court calendar moves forward. Here's where this lands. The Supreme Court struck down Trump's emergency tariffs. A trade court ordered the refunds. $100 billion has already moved, and the fight over the remaining $75 billion and the interest is still very much alive in the appeals process. This is one of the biggest financial legal disputes in American history, and it's happening right now, mostly out of the spotlight, while the news cycle chases other things. But the outcome of this fight, who gets refunded, how much, and whether the administration's appeals succeed in narrowing the pool, that outcome matters for real businesses, real money, and the future limits of presidential power. So stay tuned, because the next court ruling in this case could change the number by tens of billions of dollars overnight. And when that happens, you're going to want to already understand exactly what's going on. The removal of an unconstitutional tariff burden from the economy is a real thing, and it's worth understanding in full, because this is not just a boardroom story, it's an everywhere story, and most people don't realize it yet. The Supreme Court has spoken. The refunds are flowing. And the administration's fight to limit those refunds is creating one of the most consequential legal battles of the modern era. Whether you support Trump or oppose him, whether you think tariffs are good policy or bad policy, the fact remains that $100 billion has already been returned, and potentially $175 billion more could follow. That is real money with real consequences for real people. And that is why this story deserves your attention.